Nederlandse film. Zie je op het Nederlands Film Festival, 27 september tot en met 5 oktober in Utrecht.
Hello, welcome to this session, Ethics versus Critics. My name is Tara Judah. I'm going to be the moderator today, and I work in Bristol in the UK at a cultural institution called Watershed, which is a cinema and multimedia arts venue, and also I'm a freelance film critic. I'm joined today by 3 incredibly talented panelists, so I would like to actually let them introduce themselves. We've got 2 filmmakers and a curator. We're going to be delving into this topic in quite a lot of detail, so if I could get each of you to please introduce yourself and actually the projects that you've been working on that we're going to kind of tease out some issues around in this topic today. Sunny, if we could start with you.
Okay, my name is Sunny Bergman. I'm a documentary maker, a writer, and an activist. And I've made a lot of documentaries concerning race and gender. And I think people see my documentaries as activist. I encounter a lot of resistance, in the Netherlands at least, because of fighting racism and sexism. So basically, that's a summary of what I do. Yeah, and I think I don't believe in clear boundaries between being a filmmaker and an activist and a writer.
Perfect, thank you. And Asha?
My name is Ashar Medina. I'm a screenwriter, sometimes director. I have written, I write for film and TV, and I've written 2 television movies, one concerning Syrian refugees in a camp in Calais, the jungle. I've written Tom Adelaar about a Surinamese call center agent who cannot use his own name and culture, has to change that to typically Dutch names and accents to score. And I've written a crime series called Mokro Mafia, which was quite controversial when it was released last year.
Thank you, and Anna.
My name is Anna Bagutska. I'm a film programmer, curator, podcaster, and kind of event producer. I used to, up until quite recently, be the film and events programmer at the British Film Institute in London at their Cinematheque. And one of the projects that I'll be discussing here today was a repertory film season of films and events concerning unlikable female characters that was titled Playing the Bitch, which got a little bit of heat from the academic and the critical community, especially online when it was announced.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do is kind of start by looking at some of the projects that each of you have worked on that you've just mentioned and the challenges that you came across along the way. So this is called Ethics versus Critics. And I think what we want to kind of look at today is one aspect is the ethical responsibility that you feel when you're tackling subjects that you know are heated in the context that they're going to go out to. So, for example, Sunny, you know that the mainstream is going to be resistant to the film that you're making, or they're not going to kind of receive it perhaps with through the lens that you might hope that they would. What are the challenges that you set about from production and then also into distribution and the reception with the audience? If you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so I think, as a filmmaker, when I'm entering a subject, I try and surround myself with a lot of people that, like when we're in the editing, for example, that watch the film with me, and try to bring it as nuanced as possible. And funnily enough, a lot of people meet, like when they see my film, they thought like, oh, it's quite, balanced, or they have a different expectation because they also know me as, like, I guess, an activist, or I'm outspoken about certain things. But when I'm making a film, I do try to permit doubt, and also I think an important aspect is to make myself vulnerable in the film. So as you're trying to bring across a new story about, for example, sexism, you can also talk about your own internalized sexism, or your own internalized racism, to show that you're not taking the moral high ground. So you just like what I try to do with my films is that for people to start reevaluating maybe their own thinking or their own presuppositions. So in the film, I try to bring that vulnerability so that people don't feel like I'm preaching to them. But a lot of people that are very angry with me, I don't think they even watch the film, or they watch it wanting to be angry. So they'll pick at things on which they can be very angry.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. So, obviously, some of the issues that you touch on there, that they're issues that people feel very prickly about because they have strong associations with, and people don't like to think that they might be being gender biased or racist when they consider themselves perhaps to be more liberal than that. And fascinatingly, I think in your documentary surrounding the Black Pete character, that you do talk a lot with your neighbours, and I wondered if that conversation obviously must have been in some ways difficult, but also you obviously know your neighbours. How is it when you try to have that conversation with people that you don't know at all? Like you said, you're trying to show your vulnerability as well and insert yourself into that position. Do they just want to shut you down before you're even able to kind of open up the conversation?
Yeah, it's hard sometimes because people often approach me like they're like, let me tell you how it really is. And because I'm like, doing this as a job in my private life, I don't always feel like debating stuff. So if I feel like, I don't know, the other day I had a debate or there was an evening where we had an exchange of ideas and a lot of people were invited, and someone, I was talking about white privilege and institutional racism, and someone says, well, I don't really believe that's true. I don't believe in those things. And I said, well, if you don't believe in that, I mean, it's not really an opinion. And I was like listing all the research that is backing up the idea that institutional racism is a thing. And then he was like shaking his head, and I was like, well, I'm not going to continue this conversation then, because you believe it's a matter of opinion, but I mean, I've done my research and I know what I'm talking about. And if you can't accept that this is actually something I'm more of an expert on than you are, then there's no point, like you don't want to have an open dialogue. So I walked away, and he was very angry, like, you have to debate me, you have to. And I said, well, I don't have to, actually. So this is like, this kind of dynamics happens a lot, yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to move on as well to Asher and pick up on some of the similar points about whether or not you set out, we talked a little bit previously about intent. When you're writing, is it your intent to change people's minds? Do you think that your work has the power to do that? Or do you write with the intent of the message that you want to get across? And then do you accept that when it goes out into the world, there might be some ambiguity as to how that is received?
Well, I think the last part that you just spoke about, I think that's inherent in art. I think art is supposed to challenge ideas, and you will always have a discourse where people will say yes or no. Or I also make entertainment, so it's like this gray area where I'm at, where I try to write not only my message, my own feelings, sorry, but I also need to entertain people. If you work in a commercial field, you have to draw an audience. So when we write Mokro Mafia, it's a crime series, and the most difficult part for me is that I obviously disagree with crime. I obviously think of it as a tragedy, especially when it involves young people, like in our series. So people will accuse us of glorifying it. I would say we romanticize it, not to make it prettier, but to say this is a story. We take a real thing, we fictionalize it, and then you can decide what you think of it. In our story, everyone ends up either dead or in jail or with a broken soul, because I believe that's what crime does to you. But a lot of people will say just by making it, we're glorifying it. I don't believe that to be true. So there is obviously a message, my personal message, which is don't do crime, please don't. But obviously it will be presented also from a viewpoint of some of the characters that do step into this world because they believe they will get something out of it, money, excitement, status. And if you want to be truthful in fiction writing, then you have to step into the mind of that character, and that character sees certain lovely things in it, which are not. So there will be sequences where he would buy stuff, and I have to make it exciting in that character's mind, and then later on I can show the consequences of it, and then it's up to the audience to say, oh yeah, in the end it was a tragedy, just like Oedipus is a tragedy, or it has high points and low points, you know. So that's how I view it. Of course, it's going to be ambiguous to an audience, but my job is only to entice you and bring about an emotion, and hopefully after that, a thought.
Thank you. Actually, this brings me to a great point that you just touched on about the kind of tension that there always is in filmmaking and film exhibition. And sorry, Anna, we'll come to you in just a second, but to do with the commerce and the art. And obviously, everything that you create, you're putting it out there for an audience. There is, you know, it's not created in a vacuum, it's actually going out to people. How do you negotiate the tension between what you're working on as a kind of ethical responsibility to be engaged with the issues, and particularly Sunny as an activist, but also knowing that, you know, you have to hit certain targets and things to get funding, you have to make it commercially viable so that people will see it and so that audiences will get behind it to some degree, and also absolutely needs to be entertaining. So maybe, Sunny, if you could answer first, and then Anna, we can talk about exhibition in that context.
It's a very long question. So how do I deal with the different, like, can you...
So obviously when you're creating your documentaries, you know, you're an activist as well, so you believe in the issues that you're putting forward. But you also need to make the documentaries fundable, entertaining for audiences.
So it's about compromises.
Yeah, it's about the tension between those two.
Are there a lot of people from funds in the room? Because I don't know, I mean... It's a difficult road to navigate. I have had projects rejected like funding modes have rejected my projects because they think I'm biased, which brings into question the whole idea of neutrality and what is neutrality and who decides what is biased and who has the power and the status quo, and the status quo deciding what is neutrality. And I mean, when I first made my when I tried to get funding for my documentary about Black Pete, Zwarte Piet, there were 11 white people from the Taylor Doc board that decided my project was biased. And this is like a while back. I think they would see it differently now, I hope. So yes, of course it's hard to get funding, and I know probably people don't like me that have to give me money. So it's like sometimes you cater to what they want to hear. That's like something you have to do. But I try to stay true to my own quest as well, of course. And I guess as an activist, you have to be like some part of activism is more dogmatic than I would be as a filmmaker. So an activist is about achieving goals, changing the world, if you want, like changing policies. And as a filmmaker, you want to bring across a wonder. So those are two different things, but they can enrich each other.
Do you think that the mainstream did you think part of the mainstream were able to receive the film in the spirit that it was intended as also like an informative and an entertaining documentary?
The one on Black Pete?
Both. I think also the one on gender, you know, because there's also obviously moments of humor in both of these films. Mm-hmm. They are incredibly...
You mean Man-Made? That was my last film. Yeah, I've made lots of films on gender. Yes, I think a lot of, for example, the documentary I made on race, I made 2 in the last 5 years, Zwart als Roet, Our Colonial Hangover, and The Color White, with Zokenkleur. A lot of people have told me they've watched it and it has changed their perception. And people ask me but you're not reaching the really extreme right or something, like the people that vote PVV or Forum for Democratie. And I think but that's not really my aim. I have no illusions on that. I'm very happy when people, like for example, when the film on Black Pete, I know that people in positions of power watched it because they sent me messages afterwards, like ministers, and said they had changed their mind on Black Pete. So that's, I think, I'm happy when that happens because they are in positions to actually change things.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Anna, I'd like to bring you in to talk a bit about, after obviously the filmmakers do all of their tiresome work to get these films created, then in the process of curation, and I mean, you can talk about other projects as well, but specifically I think the Playing the Bitch season is really fascinating example of when the intention behind a season or a curation or the intention to entertain and inform audiences and create discussion takes a turn because obviously the media storm that kind of went around the season threw it into a sort of different, catapulted it into a different sphere, and where that conversation came from. So if you could talk a bit about that.
Of course. So just to maybe give a little bit of context for the season. So it was a repertory mainly season. It was about 11 films, meaning that they were all old films ranging from the 1930s to the 2000s. And we're kind of also surrounded by contextual events, so conversations that were tackling some of the questions that I wanted to ask with the project. And kind of the bulk of the reaction came from two things. One was the use of the word bitch, which is very sensitive as a word and very offensive to some people, and I was fully aware of all of the connotations related to it, but I was also aware of how a lot of women and a lot of really powerful women were reclaiming the word and using it as both a term of endearment and a term of empowerment. And it was also a trope that I had recognized in cinema, something that I had seen from films from the 1920s, especially in the 30s and the 40s, and then had its peaks and ebbs in especially kind of the most culturally dominant cinema, which is American cinema. You could see a very particular type of female character and the relationship of those characters. And I'm thinking of, the Mildred Pierces or the Baby Janes as portrayed by Bette Davis, almost anyone Joan Crawford ever played. Or Meryl Streep's character in The Devil Wears Prada as a recent example, or Bridget Gregory in The Last Seduction, just to name a few kind of examples to bring characters into your mind. So my main intention was not to be dogmatic or prescriptive or saying these women or these actresses are bitches. It was looking at familiar and similar characteristics that all of these characters shared, and especially the power that the actresses brought, not just to the screen, but to the power dynamics behind the screen and the relationship with the audience. Because a lot of these films, most of these films were directed by men, very often written by women. So there was always a control of the story, and the control of the narrative also came a lot from the performances because they were very often larger than life. Everybody remembers Meryl Streep in The Devil Wears Prada. Nobody remembers who directed it. Sorry to the filmmakers on the stage, but kind of that power of the performance is the angle that I wanted to take, and kind of the relationship of especially female audiences, and coming even from a personal experience of the way that I related to these women, related or examined them or relished their presence on screen, and kind of what the questions that arose from that, especially around unlikable female characters, that became a word in vogue, especially after Phoebe Waller-Bridge's Fleabag broke out a few years prior to the season. And kind of a lot of conversation had started about what it means for us to see women who are not fundamentally likable. And likability is a term that really only refers to women. It's intrinsically gendered. And even the word bitch instantly conjures up both kind of really powerful, sometimes negative, and sometimes positive kind of images of a woman in control. So that whole season, and there's many ways to curate, that whole season was never prescriptive. It was designed to kickstart a dialogue and a debate. I wanted to start a debate about what it means to be an unlikable woman on screen, what it means for that power dynamic between the performer, the character and the audience, and kind of how those performances can also bring authorship into the films, that it doesn't always just rely on the director or the figure of the writer-director as the ultimate author of the story. So there was a lot of thinking going in behind the season, and it was around June last year that it happened, and to be honest, the reaction was preliminary, so it came a few months before the full project was even properly announced or revealed. There was just a little blurb of about 50 words in a press release with a working title, and there was a very strong reaction from the film community. And I think the intent, I think with very intensely curated projects, the intent and the questions that the curator poses need to be front and center. So with that project, kind of when it actually materialized and happened, the actual events and the atmosphere and the debates were fascinating and deeply rich, and kind of everything that was the design of it, which was to start a conversation, to rethink certain positions, to even consider what it meant culturally in the UK to use the B word, because it did not mean the same thing in London or the wider UK as it did, say, in America, or as it did in other countries. I'm not British, so there was kind of a different angle that I used from my personal experience to it that was different from many people in the audience. But it's the intent, I think, with kind of curatorship for that particular project was always to pose a question as opposed to give an answer. My kind of contribution to it, aside from kind of putting it together and generating the idea and developing all of it with a lot of help from colleagues at that time, was always to kind of look at and define this particular type of character. And I was very ready for, in the process of the development, and as I was preparing for a particular series of talks that I had to do, that I had built into the project, to be proven wrong as well. Maybe the more I thought about it and the more I interacted with people and the more the debate kind of continued, I was very ready to also be convinced otherwise. So the whole curatorial design around it was around a question as opposed to a statement.
Thank you. I think actually that's a really important point about the kind of practice being to pose a question rather than to create an answer. Because I think that you're absolutely right about perception is that the intent must be to give an answer rather than to pose a question. And I wondered how that fits in for filmmaking, and also if you come up against ever people curating your work and framing it perhaps in ways that you're maybe not so pleased about, or it doesn't reflect your intent. Asher, if you want to respond.
It comes back to that ambiguity you were talking about, like how do you receive something. I'm writing something that kind of touches upon Sunny's documentary about Black Pete. I don't know if everyone here knows what Black Pete is actually, but it is a symbol from a national holiday we have. Like our Santa Claus is called Sinterklaas, and he has black helpers, black slaves. They're painted black, they have big red lips, fuzzy, curly black hair, and this is a tradition that we still have. So Sunny made a wonderful documentary about what that actually means, and the term colonial hangover, it harkens back to it.
Yeah, the film is actually called Our Colonial Hangover in English.
And I'm writing a satire. I'm writing a film. It's called Neuk Piet, the Fuck Piet, because these Black Piets have all different roles. You have like the Help Piet, the Roadmap Piet. So I created a stand-up comedian who creates a caricature called the Fuck Piet, because he's throwing it back in our society. Like, this is a stereotypical image of a over-sexualized black man. So right now I'm trying to get funding for it. So this is not going to be an easy road, but I believe when you see these things in society and you want to say something about it, then you have documentary, you have expositions, you have curatorship, and I, as a writer, I have these tools that I can write anything I want on paper. And hopefully people will say, okay, this has merit. So it depends very much on like the funding. There's going to be people deciding if we have the right to make this, because our film industry is I would say 90% dependent on film funding, I think. So yeah. You're dealing with this constantly. how people are going to perceive it. Not only the audience, but in between you and the audience are people that have their own opinions, their own worldview, their own politics, and this is
and they decide what's relevant.
And do you read like all of the reviews or all of the journalistic articles and stuff around these things, or do you stay away from that part of the conversation to kind of protect yourself at some point? You know, is it your desire to continue, you know, with that work, that intent that you have, the conversation? Obviously, the internet is a terrifying place where everyone's allowed to comment and say whatever they want with no kind of consequences or culpability. How do each of you kind of navigate that terrain? So if we start with Sunny.
Well, I'm not on Twitter because of that, because it's just intense, the hatred. And yeah, I've learned a while back to know that the hate that I receive doesn't say anything about me, but it says something about the person sending it. But sometimes it's hard. I mean, especially when you're like I don't know. I made the mistake of like watching live on Twitter when my last film was on TV, and yeah, it didn't feel good. But in general, I've become harnessed against all the negativity, and I mean I'm very much open for criticism. So if someone says something intelligent that you know that is critical, I'd like to think about it or enter a dialogue. But if people just like want to attack your character or the way you look or whatever, you know, like it's just not interesting really. So I guess when I do read it, it's like on the one hand a bit of like torture, but it's also interesting to analyze it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Asha, do you engage with the criticism?
Well, sometimes I have to, especially with the Mokra Mafia series we made. It was very much picked up, very much by the youth. So I get a lot of comments, sometimes very nice. You know, a lot of people are waiting, like, when's the second season gonna come? So that gives me, that warms my heart, so to say. But there's a lot of people that said, you're stigmatizing
yeah, I was curious about that.
Stigmatizing Surinamese people, and for me it's crazy that people say this because this is real life. 2 weeks ago, a lawyer was murdered for the first time in the Netherlands. A lawyer was murdered, so they call it like we're turning into a second Naples, like with the mafia. You know, this is an attack on our state, and this is all coming forth from actually these gangs, but actually not the gangs. It is a tax system that allows this in the Netherlands. It is a judicial system we have. It is a social ladder that these boys, young men mostly, are so hopeless they will never imagine it to climb. So it is through all layers of society. This is something that's being created. When Martin Scorsese made Goodfellas, or when Coppola made Godfather, there were Italian League, but we're protesting it because they say you're defamating us, you're stigmatizing us. But it's actually the other way around. There's a cultural phenomenon, and we as artists see that and see the drama in that, see the heartbreak in that, and see also the romanticization of it. So it's the snake that keeps eating itself. These things happen. We make art about it, and some people say people are going to do that. And then we make art about it, and people are going to do it. So, no, I think art could always reflect on what happens.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm curious because I did read that commentary. Like, okay, now the term Mokro Mafia is like out there, and people associate Dutch Moroccan people more with crime than before. And I was thinking about this, and of course what you say is true. Like, art can take anything as inspiration, but as a writer, you do have a choice to pick up on one story. Like, you could bring a whole different story that's also a reality of Moroccan youths in the Netherlands.
And I do.
Yeah, I do. No, but how? I mean, how do you make that choice?
Well, I think, for example, I wrote a TV film, and that was not about Dutch Moroccan youth in here. It was about Syrian youth and Moroccan youth and Afghanistan youth in Calais. like I talked about. And the stigma that's on refugees is they're overflowing Europe and the Western world. So what we did was we heard and read a lot about Calais. In Calais, there was this refugee camp called the Jungle, which they called the Jungle because it was the worst place in the whole Europe. So we went there for 3 days. And what I saw was young people, mostly men, but also young women that came along that were highly educated, that were extremely motivated, that carried around their diplomas and sometimes their salary slips of their country back home. Because they were like, we're not coming here to take away anything from you, really. We want to contribute. So then that's a movie I also wrote, trying to make. Tomadelaar, another movie I wrote about young people in call centers, not from Dutch backgrounds, who cannot use their own name. When I did it at work, when I would call people and say, hi, Ashar Medina, and use my accent that's not as proper as I would use, they wouldn't buy anything from me. So when I say, hallo meneer, met Tomadelaar, and they would.
Yeah.
So says another thing, is that these are also educated young people who try to contribute, but sometimes come to encounter obstacles. So my work is, I hope to think it's as broad as it can be, without denying that there's also this factor of, I grew up in Amsterdam West, where I saw also around me a lot of crime also. So I think it would be dishonest of me to only try to portray only the good or only the bad. So I try to present the broad spectrum.
Can I pick up on Sonia's kind of question to you? Kind of not coming from not from a creative perspective, but not from a maker of films or documentaries. Kind of the choice, it almost, when you want to create something or curate something or ask a question or put forward a project or put something out to the public, essentially, it almost doesn't feel like a choice, like you need to do it. It's a need. It's a story that you want to tell, or it's a story or it's a question that you want to pose. It's something that niggles in your mind.
You mean when inspiration hits you, or
it just doesn't go away. You know, I've lost count of how many events and seasons and panels and discussions and curatorial projects. Some of them have very specific stories that I wanted to say. Some of them had very clear angles of when they made sense, and I would kind of talk about them and position them in kind of such a way to, tell that story. And like the Playing the Bitch season was probably niggling in my mind for about a decade, if not more, while it was taking shape and just kind of factoring in a lot of things that I was seeing during my film education, during my screen education, during life. And kind of the more the language became apparent and some of the questions and the themes and the kind of general strokes and coincidences that I could then see, then I had the platform and the opportunity to go through that very similar process to, I guess, pitching a film is, there is a process of pitching and development and, scoping out and designing a curatorial project as well, especially one that you want to create conversation with. And it also takes a personal toll. Like in response to your question, Tara, I could not go on Twitter for basically a month. I tried to avoid it because when I read things, it upset me so much that I became physically ill. But that kind of was not the point. They did take a point of pride in the fact that there was a debate going on about things. There was a debate going on about kind of character representation. There was a debate going on about the B word. And there was a debate going on about some of the absences that I had pointed out in kind of screen history, and how television was very much a part of it, that it was not just film. And that's also very much part of my kind of curatorial practices, that I've very much taken the approach that, especially now and, basically in the last 10 years, if not more, the media that we consume, film, television, YouTube content, memes, all of that, that's all part and informing our screen culture. We can no longer separate it and take a kind of a highbrow and a lowbrow approach, because the influence is very similar kind of on the way that people think and the way that people can receive that screen content, essentially. But I'm kind of going back to the question that you were discussing earlier, is sometimes you don't really have a choice. If you feel the need to tell the story or to ask the question, you just have to.
Do any of you feel as though I think that's a great point to pick up on in terms of the need to tell a story, or you feel like you really have to kind of get this out there. If you're trying to get something out there and you come up across barriers, perhaps that's funding bodies, perhaps and certainly in curatorial as well, it might be that it's the institutions have some resistance, or you might have to kind of write and rewrite your sort of statements of intents or your project outlines to kind of get it through. Do you ever consider changing it to something like, particularly because obviously you're working in genre and documentary, do you consider like taking that to a more extreme, like fantasy or genre cinema, or creating it in a way that reframes it so that you can get the message through because it's something you're desperate to work on, or do you let the project drop? And in curatorial practice, do you ever change the focus of the season to get the same message through there but through a different lens? If any of you have ever had to do that with your projects, please feel free to answer.
I don't know. I guess I just persevere when I encounter rejection. Just keep on going. I don't try and change it too much.
Yeah.
Just keep hopeful. Yeah.
Well, I don't really necessarily change an idea I had, because for me genre and for me form and content is a two-headed beast. So when I have something spark, then I quite quickly will see what form it needs to be. So for the fuck beat, it has to be a satire. So it plays in the Netherlands, where it's not really now. It's in the Netherlands where there's a referendum. Is that an English word as well? That's right, yeah. Referendum about whether Black Pete can stay or not. This is a total fiction.
Yeah.
So in this world, there will be more polarization, and actually the subtitle is "Fuck Pete" or "How I Found Myself and Accidentally Unchained the Race War." So it's a total fabrication. It goes way over the top, So that's the only way I could tackle this subject.
It's not so unrealistic.
No, because for us, like I think we think the same. We view it the same way. A lot of people are, like you said, there is no problem. It's not racism. A lot of other people are like, it is only racism, and you need to fight. I also don't believe you need to physically fight people. But I don't know. I don't have an answer. I can only write about this and only express my feelings about it. But I do think there's
not so many people who think they should be physical fights, though.
No, I said there are people who think. I don't say many people. I'd say there are people that say this, and there are people that think you should physically.
No. But I mean that's interesting because, like, a lot of the activists against Black Pete are sometimes they were in the past framed as violent or aggressive, but there is no one I know that has ever wanted to resort to violence. Actually, really. Yeah.
I do know people. I'm just saying that there are both. I know people. I know of extreme rights that also wants to fight. I know of extreme other side that would say. I have family members that say what we need to do is just go there and throw rock. I just say that there's this discourse that it's not really about the issue anymore. So I can only make art, and I'm not here to make a judgment about which side is. I would not say that. I would say Black Pete is racism, so it should just be gone. That's my opinion about it.
Can I ask, as a writer, do you have much control over the production, who's involved with the project once you've finished the writing process? So who directs and who produces? Because obviously there's lots of artistic decisions that will be made, after you've finished your writing, that when it comes to the screen. How involved are you in that process, or do you kind of hand it over to the next person to do their part?
It depends on if I'm hired to write. If there's a project that I would be hired to write 2 episodes, then I'm mostly in service of the thing. But my passion projects that I sometimes develop over 2, 3, 4 years, I just have only this script or this idea, and then I try to find people that are like-minded, people that I have a connection with, people I admire, that I like their work. And then you try to find common ground, because of making any film, but I think especially feature films, it takes sometimes, it could take easily this new movie, it could take 4 years, 5 years before, if it ever sees light of day, So then I think the relationships you build with people is so extremely important, because you have to keep this fire burning. want to make this thing. So in that case, I would be very, very delicate in finding my partners, and then I would try to exert some influence in the later stages, in the production or in the visualization of the film. But it could also be that a director has an amazing idea and he tells me, or he or she tells me that, and I'm like, okay, let's fucking do this, and let's go. So then I see myself as a tool in the process.
Anna, when you're curating seasons, do you feel like sometimes you have to change the focus to get the same message across? And particularly, I'm really interested in this also from a curating perspective from my own practice. When you have a really firm idea of a season or a project and some of the key films are not available or you can't get them, how do you then reframe that to still get the same kind of message or intent across? If you could talk a bit about that.
There's a lot of things there, and some of them are so practical, they're borderline boring, but you have to keep them in mind. So, for instance, to kind of use Playing the Bitch as an example, and the rest of my curatorial work, I wouldn't necessarily change the idea, but I would change or adjust the positioning. So actually, the Playing the Bitch season was really interesting because it got semi-announced prior to it actually being finalized. So I got a really good sense of kind of the tension points. So I knew kind of the important things to address in a more explicit way. So say in the copy or in any accompanying articles or things like that, that would directly engage in the conversation that had already kind of preemptively been started. Which, like I mentioned before, was the intent is to start a conversation. So in many ways, I took it as a positive. But the kind of, to answer your question, I think the positioning of a curatorial project is just as important as the content that you put into it. So when I talk about positioning, I mean basically marketing. And that means the naming of it, the copy of it, the graphics of it, the time of the year, the times of the days, the scheduling, with the pricing of the tickets, whether it's free or not, what the balance is of kind of conversations and events, talent, kind of who's part of that conversation, what forms do those conversations take? Are there events, are there podcasts, are there articles, are there tweets, are there memes, is it hashtags? So all of these different ingredients go into positioning a season. Because say for the Playing the Bitch season, there was there a fun element? Did I want there to be a fun element, kind of a more facetious, kind of raucous type of approach? Yes or no? Did I want it to use the B word, or did I want to play and skirt around it but talk about it? Did I want to address issues of class and race that I saw were kind of relevant by their absence in the sort of films that I was talking about? Did I want to address the fact that most of the films were directed by men? Did I want to address the fact that they were written by women? So, there was a lot of very different angles, and it's choosing which ones do you want to surface that can help define the positioning. But the idea, the core of it, is still the same. And the other thing to point out there as well is kind of the big kind of conundrum of curating anything is that there are experiences and conversations, and kind of how are you documenting that? How are you archiving that? How are you learning as well, especially if it's a debate-focused project? How do you then engage with the conversations that you've instigated, for instance? How much do you put yourself out there? I made the decision very early on that I didn't want to be part of every single panel because my voice was already in everything. I didn't need to put myself there to satisfy my own ego, because the whole point was of other people taking different approaches and maybe very actively but extremely eloquently disagreeing with me. And many times I was listening to conversations, I was like, oh God, that's such a great point. I kind of want to disagree with myself here. But there was also kind of the element of very, very practical levels. You're working in a venue, you're working with exhibition. You have to take into account, have we screened this film in the last year? Is this film going to draw an audience? Is bringing over this film from a print from the States going to cost more than than the whole project itself? Is this film kind of complementing the other 9-10 films in the season? So it's kind of like making a playlist, but in an extremely complicated way, where every single choice involves so much commercial thinking as well, but also relationships to prior projects and future projects as well, that an audience is not privy to. And frankly, they don't need to be part of that very kind of boring aspect of curatorship, where you have to make it fit for the right moment, and considering your limitations that are sometimes literally because the films are in rights hell, they're not available to screen, or they are available to screen, but there are no materials to screen them from. And you have a responsibility to deliver the best possible screening quality or projection quality to your audience. So you kind of have to be adjusting the actual content, so the choice of films that you're screening, kind of as you go, because sometimes things will arise, and there was films on my list that couldn't be cleared.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you brought up something really important here, which is marketing and framing and the kind of positioning of these projects. And certainly what I found fascinating in the UK, to give people here a bit of context about the Bitches season, was that last year, the venue that I work in had run a season on witches, which wasn't totally dissimilar, because it was about the concept of gender and the portrayal of females as witches in popular culture across television and film. The main difference that I would say was in the fact that, like you said, yours had been kind of pre-announced before you'd had the chance to give the marketing for it. And the witch season, which didn't cop any flack at all, that played in a different city in the UK, was called Reclaiming the Witch. And I really think that the title of the season, even though I'm not actually 100% sure that you could say that it was a reclamation so much in the curatorial act of putting the films together, but just that putting that word in the title made a very big difference to the perception of how it was presented. And so I wondered if, from a filmmaking perspective, one, how much control you have over the marketing of your own films and the kind of distribution that they then go into, but also what your views are on how you can position it to sort of mitigate some of those controversies.
Yeah. I was just thinking about some of the titles I changed of my films in the process. I think the titles I choose in the beginning are a little bit too far out. Like, I remember the film, which is translated in English, where we brought it to the international market as The Color White, but we call it White is Also a Color in Dutch, Wit is ook een kleur. And I think the working title was Angry White People, which we decided after a while, like, it might not draw an audience, or people would get too angry beforehand.
Self-fulfilling.
Yeah, a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then we had this documentary on masculinity that was recently finished, and I think the working title was Save Men, which we also changed to Man-Made. So I did get some flack from people around me saying that those titles that you come up with are too extreme, and I listened to them. And I really concern myself with the press release and the promos and all those things, because I do find that often people water it down or don't really get the message. And I remember when I won the documentary Over the Hill, Beperkt Houdbaar, which I made about the beauty myth and the beauty industry, there was a promo being made whereby I was being made to be this insecure woman who is so worried about my looks, and so it was completely missing the point of the analysis of the film. And this was a guy who had made this promo, and we had to have a real fight like this. I don't want this promo on TV, because this is not really what I meant with this film. So I do try and stay on top of that.
Did you win the battle? Did the promo?
Yeah, we did change the promo. But funnily enough, I had the same arguments with this guy. I mean, I like him; he's a wonderful colleague. But I don't think he gets the message. And with my last film, which was analyzing masculinity, there was one sentence in the film whereby I said something like, "I guess I like muscular men as well." So it's I want to put a bit about how, as women, we keep a certain idea of masculinity intact, or we, of course, ourselves are we've internalized certain ideas about what it means to be a man. And I'm having a discussion in the film with my partner, and he says, you're the same, you like kind of masculine men as well. And I said, well, I guess I like some kind of muscles, not too much, but, and then like he put that in all the promo material, all of it, like the whole time, and it was like the headline of the newspaper article, Sunny likes muscly men, and I'm like, that wasn't what I meant. I mean, I don't go for like really buff guys, and anyway, why does that need to be highlighted? But I think that was like, the idea was like, you see, it's the women's fault, like they keep this idea of masculinity intact. And interestingly enough, when I first wrote the proposal for the funding, they rejected it by saying, you haven't written enough about how women keep masculinity in place. I was like, what? We are the victims of sexism, so now we have to become the perpetrators? Interesting. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you. Asha, do you have much involvement in that process, or once you've kind of finished the writing process, is that?
Again, depending on if I'm a hired gun or...
Would you change the title Fuck Pete?
This is an interesting question. We've had many discussions with our producer, with a lot of people that said, if you're going to submit it, first of all, you're probably not going to get it on posters, which I can understand. I mean, in a public space, it is a curse, you know. So I would not want to put that upon parents that have children. I don't think that's fair. So it's going to be difficult. That'll be a difficult thing. Maybe we do it with stars, or maybe we'd have like a censorship sticker on it. I don't know. But the title for me is inherently, not only is it the character of the stand-up comedian, but for me inherently it says, I don't know, I can't really explain it. But once we found it, we had it. It was so natural. It felt so good. So for now, for the funding and with the pitch documents and everything, we do it, and we have the subtitle inspired by Dr. Strangelove, the Stanley Kubrick satire. So it's Fuck Pete, or how I found myself and accidentally unchained the race war. So I think the complete title tells you it is a satire. I hope. I hope people will see that we're not only trying to provoke. I hope that they see we're trying to create a mirror. For marketing, I think I have ideas about posters. I have ideas about how you would use social media, because I think, especially in the Netherlands, we're not very adept at that. Not very good at it. The Dutch cinema has seen a decline, a major decline, the last couple of years. In the sense that more people go to the movies, but less people go to Dutch films, which is a problem. And I don't really know why that is, but I think one of the reasons is that we do not have the best marketing system, that we don't really know how to reach, especially the younger generation. And when I hear my generation, or friends of mine, or a generation below me, they say, I never go to Dutch films. And then I ask a lot of people, what's the last Dutch film you've seen in a theater? And it gets quiet. When I speak to my foreign friends, I ask them, what's the last Dutch film you've seen? Ask it yourself. I don't know. A lot of people even say, I've never really ever seen a Dutch film. And I think I would like to keep it at our, so we have to raise the quality, but we also have to think about what is our film culture? What is our stamp? What is, if you think about French film, you have a certain image, or UK, British film, or American film, or Japanese film, or I even don't really know what is Dutch film. So I think
there's normally something with hearts, isn't it? Hartenstraat or Harten.
We have a lot of romantic comedies. And nothing wrong with romantic comedies, but all romantic comedy all day makes Jack a dull boy. So I think,
So this question about audience is really key, and actually probably we're slightly running out of time, so we might make this the kind of final focus to think about. And I don't think that...
Taking questions from the audience?
We will, yeah. We only have a couple of minutes, and I can't see the audience at the moment, so maybe we get the lights to come up. And if you have a burning question, please do pop your hand up and we'll come to you. But I just wanted to ask you all a little bit about, because I don't think the Netherlands is unique in that everywhere in Europe, everywhere people are having trouble with attracting younger audiences, keeping younger audiences, getting them to go to the theatre to watch more challenging content. And I think part of that is to do with this idea of the polarization that we're seeing in the wider political context, but certainly like the controversies surrounding the work that you've each been doing, is that people want to guarantee before they go to the cinema that they're going to be in agreement with, or they're going to like the thing that they're going to see. I think the kind of entertainment aspect that you mentioned previously, Asher, and this idea of marketing and positioning has become, people are in a position now where there's a lot of things vying for their attention. They have more access to information than ever before. They can do more research before seeing a film than we used to be able to do. The internet has given us that capability. So we can find out whether or not, in theory, we think we're going to like something before we go to the cinema. And I think people are very keen to kind of know whether or not they agree righteously, or, cancel culture, snowflakes, whatever you want to call it. They want to kind of know that they're going to be on side with what they're going to see. So before I ask, for each of you to kind of give a final sentiment on that, do we have any audience questions? If you could pop your hand up. I'm finding it a little bit difficult to see. I think there is one just over here. And I believe that if I throw this in your general direction, that you can speak into it. This could be very comical, though, because I'm not great with throwing things.
Yes.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a question for Sunny. I really admire the way you make films, making
Thanks.
yourself very vulnerable. You're literally putting the camera towards yourself, which has made you a public figure.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that has been a price you have had to pay by becoming a public figure?
Funnily enough, I always forget that I'm a public figure. So, I don't know, the other day I was recognized in the sauna. That wasn't so comfortable. But the biggest price we had to pay was in the question of safety. There was a time when the death threats were so serious that I had to leave the country with my family, and we had to protect the house and stuff. So I think at that point, that was. But apart from that time, no, I don't know. I don't walk around feeling like I'm a public figure. The other day, I was at a party and someone said "Hey, you're Sunny Bergman. Cool." What am I supposed to say? But yeah, so the safety issue was a thing for my family, but apart from that, I feel I can still live my life relatively the same as I do normally. And funnily enough, being really personal in my work, I'm not embarrassed about strangers. I'm more embarrassed about the people close to me. For example, I wrote a book and it had a lot of my thoughts and feelings about sexuality, and I was really embarrassed about thinking that my parents were going to read it. Yeah, but
thank you.
And we've got one down here, so if we can, good luck throwing it. Oh,
wow.
Amazing! Did a lot better than I did.
We both played handball, I believe. I have a question about the funding, because to me, the topics that you choose, Sunny, and I believe Asher as well, it's going to be increasingly hard for you to get the money to make the films that you want to make. So how will you deal with that?
Why do you think it's increasingly hard?
Because you just told me that you come across panels of 13 white people who are really not ready to see another Black Pete movie, for example.
I guess I hope some kind of wokeness is reaching these funding boards as well. So, I mean, diversity and inclusion is a kind of a buzzword. So I don't feel so pessimistic, but it's it's the same problem over and over. I don't think it's getting worse.
It's not getting worse.
I don't think
it's getting slightly better, even maybe. Yeah.
I also believe it's getting. I believe it's getting slightly better, and I think we have a responsibility as filmmakers. This last year, I was for the first time invited into the NPO Fonds, in a commission, in which you curate plans that are submitted.
You give me money now.
Sorry?
You are part of the person.
I'm for the fiction.
Okay.
So why when I'm in the commission, I cannot submit anything. So I exclude myself from this process of trying to make projects for as long as I'm in it, which is not maybe for my career the best decision during these periods. But I believe it's my responsibility, because if we say these commissions need to be a representation of our society, then when we have a chance to participate, I will. So I think it's a balance between activism. I don't like to call myself an activist, but I think what you said is as long as you're trying to promote or incite action, then you are a little bit of an activist. So I believe that when we have these opportunities to change it from the inside out and participate in the decision making, because that's where we get the chance to broaden our palette. So then I try to do it. Or when I'm invited into a film fund commission, then I do it. Even if I'm excluded from the round to try to make my own project. So I think it's a balance between trying to say, like, I want things to change, so I will participate in the change, and be an artist saying, give me the freedom to create my art, you know? But I think like you say, it's inclusion and diversity. I see progress, actually, to be honest.
Well, that's good.
Why do you not like to call yourself an activist?
Well, because the stigma of it. Because as soon as I'm an activist, then in perception of some people, it'd be okay. So you're not an artist because you're biased, like you said, or
okay. So you're just like. Yeah, because the same goes for the word feminist, but that's why I've always like explicitly used it, just to like rebrand the word or just show what is the mean. I mean, my next film is going to be on activism, so I'm interested.
No, I understand, and it is true. Like inherently, what the word means, it is true. It's just I try to create a path for myself. It's like, am I going to debate these people about semantics, about which word they give me for me being, or I'm going to be me and make the things I want to make. So it's it's difficult, this discussion, because you have to sometimes change the terminology, but it can also become this.
You don't always feel like the debate.
No, and then I just think, no, just let me just write my stuff, and you will see it when it's on TV or in TV.
There's also an element of, just to pick up on that, there's an element of responsibility that comes with labeling yourself as an activist, which is kind of, it's every individual's choice whether you want to accept that responsibility or not.
Yeah.
Okay, if we don't have any final questions, I don't see a hand at the moment, I think we need to leave it there because it is our time. If you could please join me in thanking our three panelists very much, Sunny, Asher and Anna.